Friends and family of the Archdiocesan Cathedral of the Holy Trinity, this is our fourth week of Great Lent, our fourth pre-sanctified liturgy. We've just celebrated and had the great blessing of celebrating with us Deacon Bartholomew Mercado, and I'll introduce him in just a moment, who is a schoolmate actually of mine. I arrived at Holy Cross in 2009, and I would imagine at that point the good deacon was in his undergraduate studies at Hellenic College, where he received his BA, went on to obtain a Master of Divinity from Holy Cross, Greek Orthodox School of Theology, and a Master of Theology there as well. And after graduation, and we remained in touch, and his travels and his academic journey took him to Rome, where he studied and continues studies at the Pontifical Oriental Institute, where he is close to having a PhD in canon law. And the topic this evening, which he will also introduce when he speaks, is the applications of the canons in contemporary fasting practices. And at the same time, he is the Secretary General of the Society for the Law of the Eastern Churches, which is an amazing achievement for someone. And I know there have been a great number of our schoolmates who I've been so proud of to be a part of, some fantastic servants of our church, lay and ordained. And Deacon Bartholomew, when I, and I'll say this, heard that you were coming to New York, I was overjoyed, and it's just such a great blessing to be among family, the family that we make at Hellenic College and Holy Cross. A dear friend and a priest said, you don't go there to make friends, you go there and you make family. And I feel that way about the good deacon and about so many of the clergy that I've been blessed to have had formative years of study with. And I'm excited because I have an interest in canon law, and I think like me, you were the TA, teaching assistant for Dr. Patsavos, who also is a canon lawyer. So, and that's about all I want to say, because the good deacon has much more to offer. But again, I'm just overjoyed. I feel a sense of pride as just a brother priest. I can't say too much of a father, but to the extent that we serve together at the holy table, to really be able to connect with one another and to share the gifts and to have been together as students and continuing our learning and our journey together is a great blessing for me. So with that, let's give a warm welcome to Deacon Bartholomew Mercado.
First and foremost, I would like to thank both Father Nicholas and Father Sotirios, for their warm hospitality, and this entire community for this hospitality, for allowing me the opportunity to not impart any wisdom, but just kind of verbally express some of my own thoughts and studies on the canonical tradition of the Orthodox Church. And whenever we speak about the canons of the Church, as I'll get into in a little bit, it's always a little bit of a difficult territory to navigate. Especially when we talk about certain issues such as fasting. And perhaps one of the most notable things that distinguishes us Orthodox Christians from most other Christian confessions is our fasting practices. I mean, we have many things that distinguish us from other Christian confessions, but this is one thing in particular. And after all, most other Christian denominations do not fast, while the ones that do, and in particular the Catholic Church, have different fasting methods, especially in these contemporary times. Oftentimes we hear our Catholic friends bemoaning the fact that they have to give up something for Lent, whether it's meat multiple times a week, giving up sweets, or I know even some friends who have given up smoking for Lent. It's interesting. And for us Orthodox Christians, however, we look at this selective fasting as something kind of foreign, either foreign to our own concepts or foreign to orthodoxy. We know very well in our own tradition that it entails strict fasting regulations which limit certain types of foods that we cannot eat during the fasting periods. Us Orthodox Christians have typically learned our fasting heritage from our yayades, our papudes, mothers, fathers, family members, but let's be serious, it's always the yayades that tell us these things. They are the stalwarts of tradition when it comes to orthodoxy. And it's a type of sincere and authentic piety. And even though we talk about yayology sometimes, let's be honest, we all love yayology. We all love what the yayades have to tell us because it's authentic, because it's from their own hearts. And they teach us that fasting is not just something that we do during Holy and Great Lent, but it is something that occurs throughout the ecclesiastical year. During Great Lent, we have prolonged and varying fasting periods. The Great Lenten period lasts for 48 days, but we also have the period of Apokreos and the period of Tirophagu. But it is during Great Lent that we encounter this particular struggle, the struggle of fasting. And, we have also learned from our yayades, papudes, and family members that these certain types of food that we abstain from sometimes have an additional meaning. During the weekdays of Great Lent, with the exception of the Feast of the Annunciation, our fasting regulations state that we are to abstain from meat, dairy, eggs, fish, oil, and wine. On Saturdays and Sundays, however, we are permitted to consume oil and wine, thus rendering those days as celebratory. All of these things that we are taught are noble expressions of piety, passed down from generation to generation and preserved best as possible by the current generation. But we must ask ourselves, what do the canons actually say about fasting, and how do we make sense of these centuries-old canons in our contemporary context? And in order to answer these questions, we must first briefly explore the role of the canons in the life of the Church and their sources. Often Orthodox Christians see the canons as an ancient list of rules which are to be understood according to their letter, according to what they say verbatim. It is also all too common that we hear people arbitrarily use the phrase, and Father Nicholas and Father Sotirios know this very well. They, I'm sure, have heard the phrase, well, the canons say, without any explanation, any elaboration, without mentioning any specific canon or giving it any context, as if this is some type of trump card which automatically wins an argument. More often than not, the purported canon in such conversations turns out to not even exist. I remember a particular occasion when I was serving at a church in Italy. I was serving a liturgy, and during the gospel, I had read the gospel in Greek and then in Italian. Afterwards, someone comes up to me, after the liturgy someone comes up to me and they say, there's a canon that says that you can only do the gospel in one language. Needless to say, some years later, I'm still searching for said canon. Anyway, the word canon literally means the stem of a reed, as it was a type of ruler. Thus, it was a system of measuring. Metaphorically, this means that the canon is a model or a standard by which other things are measured. Thus, the canons of the Church are the laws or standards by which the life in the Church is governed. The canons help to govern life, church administration, and relations between members of the Church to one another, and even members of the Church to others outside of the Church's fold. The canons are temporal and practical expressions of eternal truths. Therefore, the canons in and of themselves do not constitute salvation, but they can help lead people to salvation. There is also the misconception that the canonical tradition of the Church can be found only in the Pidalium, also known in English as the rudder. And if you have any knowledge of this volume, then you might understand what I'm talking about. This is not the totality of the source of canon law, but unfortunately in some Orthodox circles it's held up as that standard. In reality, our canonical tradition is contained in various sources, all of which give additional depth to many canonical topics. These sources include Holy Scripture, ecumenical councils, local councils, Roman law, nomocanons, commentaries on the holy canons, holy traditions, synodical decrees, patriarchal decrees, and other forms of similar ecclesiastical legislation. In short, the lack of knowledge about the canons, their sources, and their context cause numerous misconceptions among the Orthodox faithful and can lead to fostering an unhealthy understanding of our canonical tradition and its role within the Church. But going back to our main topic, what do the canons say about fasting? Unsurprisingly, the canons which mention fasting are generally strict about when and how fasting should be accomplished. Let us start with the canons which direct us as to when we are to fast. There is ample and clear evidence from the canons that we are to fast on Wednesdays, Fridays, and during Holy and Great Lent. This is easily evidenced by Canon 69 of the Holy Apostles. And as a side note, when I say canon such and such of the Holy Apostles, it's not actually canons that were written by the Holy Apostles. They are attributed to the Holy Apostles. To our best knowledge, the canons of the Holy Apostles were written sometime in the 3rd to 4th centuries. Anyway, it is interesting to note that whereas this canon speaks of fasting on the aforementioned days, it makes no reference to the Apostles' fast, to the Dormition fast, or to the Christmas fast. It would appear that these fasts were later developments in the life of the Church, which were not initially part of Church tradition. Whereas the above canon dictates specific times to fast, believe it or not, there are also canons which tell us when we are not supposed to fast. Canon 66 of the Holy Apostles, promulgated, as we have previously mentioned, in about the 3rd or 4th century. Canon 18 of Gangra, promulgated in 340 AD, and Canon 55 of the Penthecti Council, promulgated in 690 AD, all state that Orthodox Christians are not to fast on Saturdays or Sundays, with the exception of Holy Saturday. It is important to note that during Saturdays and Sundays of Great Lent, we are to fast from meat, fish, dairy, and eggs, while still being allowed to consume oil and wine, as prescribed by Canon 56 of the Penthecti Council. Thus, although extremely limited, Saturdays and Sundays during Great Lent are not considered a strict fasting day, since Meletius the Confessor states that the consumption of wine, oil, and shellfish on these days constitute a breaking of the fast in some way. But one of the reasons that these canons were essentially reissued, and I'm speaking specifically of the canons of the Penthecti Council, was because at the time in the Western Church there were clergy and faithful fasting on Saturdays, which was seen as completely unacceptable in the Byzantine East. Likewise, in Armenia, you had the opposite occurring, or something similar to the opposite occurring, in which the Armenians were eating eggs and cheese on Saturdays and Sundays, even during Great Lent. Therefore, Canons 55 and 56 of the Penthecti Council were created partly to combat these practices. With the aforementioned canons, we see that the Church dictates a time to fast and a time to cease from fasting. There are other canons which touch on this topic as well, but for the sake of our time and your sanity, I will not delve into all of them. Instead, we will move on to the particular foods which are permitted or prohibited according to our fasting traditions. It must be stated from the outset, however, that the canons only occasionally mention the specific foods involved in fasting, since this is an aspect more so of holy tradition. But the detailing of these specific foods was not the main reason for the respective canons for being promulgated. Instead, as we have already seen, the canons concern themselves more so with the fact that the faithful keep the fasts of the Church during certain times of the ecclesiastical year. Nevertheless, there are some canons and sources which help to demonstrate which foods are permissible and which are not. Nicodemos the Hagiorite, or Nicodemus of Mount Athos, a learned canonist and one of the editors of the Pidalion, offered his commentary on the ancient canons for this volume as well. In his commentary on Canon 66 of the Holy Apostles, he mentions the foods which are permitted to eat during strict fasting periods and which foods are not permitted, his list being identical to what the Church prescribes today. Now, having, as briefly as I could, given you an overview of what some of these canons say about fasting, we have arrived at the raison d'etre of our lecture. How do we make sense of these canons? in contemporary society? How do we justify these centuries-old fasting regulations in a world which has so drastically changed? How can we and should we continue the fasting tradition of the Church in a manner that is compatible with the spirit of the canons? Of course, there are no easy answers to these questions, and our best course of action is to better comprehend the historical context of our canonical tradition and to use intense spiritual discernment in arriving at our conclusions. Above all, we have to be honest about the changes we see in society and the changes which have occurred, especially within the past century. This topic is not recent. This has actually been a topic of discussion for decades amongst the hierarchs of the Orthodox Church. Through the labors of the Pan-Orthodox Preconciliar Conferences stemming from the 1970s, an official document concerning fasting in the Orthodox Church was approved in 2016 at the Holy and Great Council of Crete. In this document, the Church stated that the faithful should become accustomed to fasting as an expression of repentance, as the fulfillment of a spiritual pledge, to achieve a particular spiritual end of times of temptation in conjunction with supplication to God. There have been profound changes in society within the past 100 years, much less since the first millennium, when most of these canonical references to fasting had been developed. Practical aspects such as the cost of food, access to Lenten foods, and the spiritual intent of our fasting must be sincere considerations in how to approach the present issue. According to our fasting regulations, strictly speaking, eating a prohibitively expensive lobster is somehow preferable to eating a piece of chicken. This is not to say that when we fast, we are always eating lobster, shrimp, octopus, calamaria, clams, or other such items, but because of our fasting regulations, these are somehow preferable to something that is more financially and, dare I say, spiritually sensible. Now, I don't want to appear to be saying that everyone should go to the grocery store after this lecture and pile up on steaks or chicken, but what I am suggesting is that in addition to being more mindful of our fasting from certain foods, we should also put an emphasis on other ways to fast. St. John Chrysostom says in one of his homilies, "Do you fast? Give me proof of it by your works. If you see a poor man, take pity on him. If you see an enemy, be reconciled with him. If you see a friend gaining honor, do not be jealous of him. And let not only the mouth fast, but also the eye and the ear and the feet and the hands and all the members of your bodies." St. John Chrysostom is teaching us that fasting has multiple facets, not just fasting from foods, but fasting through almsgiving, through increased good works, and certainly through increased prayer. It would be better to allow yourselves to eat something that has dairy in it as opposed to eating a seafood dish, and to use the money that you saved from the former dish in order to do a good work, in order to give to the needy. Now, I am certain that you are not hearing this for the first time. This is not a novel idea. But for some reason, there are segments within Orthodoxy which will insist that this is inconsistent with our canonical tradition. And whereas the canons I mentioned above do indeed have strict guidelines, we must also be cognizant of the era in which they were written, and even the era in which the commentaries on these canons were written. Most of the canons were promulgated between the 4th and the 9th centuries, whereas some of the greatest canonists who provided commentaries and historical context for the canons wrote their works in the 12th century. Individuals like Alexios Aristenos, Theodore Balsamon, and Zonaras. These are pillars in the Orthodox world for their canonical contributions. Even St. Nicodemos, the Hagiorite, in his commentary on Canon 66 of the Holy Apostles, makes an interesting statement which helps to show the rationale for a more economically feasible fasting approach. In his commentary, he states, "Leaving off fasting is when one eats before the 9th hour, even though it be merely figs or merely currants or raisins or anything else of this kind. Or if, besides bread and water, he should eat also some kinds of foods that are frugal and cheap, such as, for instance, legumes, wine, oil, and shellfish." It's interesting to note here that he includes shellfish, which today has become extraordinarily expensive, whereas that which has become cheaper is, of course, meat and other products that unfortunately would be considered against our fasting regulations. He clearly states that eating something that is frugal and cheap is positive to do during the fasting period, so long as it conforms to the fasting regulations in his assessment. However, today, that which has become more frugal and cheap tends to be products that contain meat and dairy, and vegetables and shellfish, which are, according to our current fasting regulations, permissible, are extraordinarily expensive. And this is where many people seem to find themselves in a dilemma concerning fasting. But on the other hand, it is also important that we as Orthodox Christians do not appear to be making excuses for ourselves to diverge slightly from our fasting tradition. If we are going to diverge from the precise fasting tradition of the Church, for whatever reason, then we must ensure that we are following some type of spiritual regimen that authentically creates in us a spirit of repentance and love, much like fasting should do. To some degree, this sentiment has been expressed through the document promulgated at the Holy and Great Council of Crete, when the Council said, "It is a fact that many faithful today do not observe all the prescriptions of fasting, whether due to faint-heartedness or their living conditions, whatever these may be. However, all these instances where the sacred prescriptions of fasting are loosened, either in general or in particular circumstances, should be treated by the Church with pastoral care. For God has no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked turn from his way and live, without, however, ignoring the value of the fast. Therefore, with regard to those who find it difficult to observe the prevailing guidelines for fasting, whether for personal reasons, illness, military service, conditions of work, etc., or general reasons, particularly existing conditions in certain regions with regard to a climate, as well as socioeconomic circumstances, i.e. the inability to find Lenten foods, it is left to the discretion of the local Orthodox churches to determine how to exercise philanthropic economia and empathy, relieving in these special cases the burden of the Holy Fast." And to just make a small side note here, when they say the local Orthodox churches, what is meant by this are the autocephalous churches, and we here in the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese are under the jurisdiction of the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople. So that is what they mean by the local churches. Ultimately, our canonical tradition on fasting, although very rigid, if one only considers the letter of the law, seems to allow for flexibility, with fasting regulations provided there is a practical necessity, and provided that there is an intent, that the intent is to supplement one's fasting with other spiritual benefits, such as almsgiving, good works, and deeper prayer. There is evidence in patristic texts and canonical sources which place a premium on spiritual intent over mere mechanical acts. Moreover, as the Holy and Great Council of Crete declared, there exists the possibility of instances where the prescriptions for fasting can be loosened. Whereas I do not believe this matter is going anywhere anytime soon, or that it will be solved in the near future, we can at least start by being honest with ourselves about our personal abilities, both physically and financially, and fasting to the extent that we can while nurturing our spiritual life through prayer and increasing our good works. For in the words of Saint Isidore of Pelusium, fasting in respect of food is of no benefit to those who fail to fast with all their senses. For whoever is successfully fighting his battle must be temperate in all things. Thank you very much for your time, and providing, if Father Nicholas would allow, I would be willing to take questions if you have any questions. I'm sure that there may be some, even if they have, something, a limited relation to the present topic, as long as it's in my field of, expertise.
I have a question, Father.
Certainly.
And there were a few beautiful ways to articulate really the significance and the helpfulness that a canon ought to offer us, rather than something necessarily restrictive or prescriptive, as something to lead us to salvation. And you just towards the end said something about the mechanical. Can you just repeat what that was?
Sure. I can't find. There's evidence in the patristic text and canonical sources which places a premium on spiritual intent over mere mechanical acts.
So spiritual intent has a premium placed on it over the mere mechanical
Yes.
execution of some.
Actually, in the canons of St. Basil, you see this a lot too, where intent has a huge role to play in how someone is penanced for a certain crime. Now, the examples that are coming to my head are more serious crimes. They don't have to do with fasting, but yes.
And now, the other beautiful, of course, piece is that it should all have as an intention on the part of whoever, if it's the local church or clergy or whoever is guiding someone in that path, for it to be filled with pastoral care, love, and mercy, for the Lord laments the death of a sinner and rather prefers one to turn and repent. And at the same time, I know these are dialogues that have been decades and centuries, and I think you alluded to sort of what's next or what can be, as much as it might be a process. Is there some theoretical framework of what might be a 21st century application, or is there an example that we have in the Orthodox world of how these fasting practices are, really meeting the local cultural context?
So there was, I already mentioned it in the course of the lecture. It was a document specifically on fasting by the Council of Crete. And this document started with, actually, the Council of Crete initially started way back. I'm talking, if you really want to go to the roots of it, you could say into the early 20th century. But the era in which it really started gaining steam was the 1960s with the conferences in Rhodes, and then when they started the Preconciliar Pan-Orthodox conferences, mainly taking place in Chambézy in the 70s, 80s, and later. And a part of those discussions, they created a list of more than 50 topics, canonical topics, liturgical topics, administrative topics, to bring to the table, all of the Orthodox churches. And one of the topics was the issue of fasting. I'm trying to remember, particularly because some of these documents went through revisions. And of course, from the 1960s or 70s, when they started really drafting some of these documents to the present time, there were copious revisions. And some of the items that were initially intended to be at the Council of Crete didn't make the cut at the end of the day, due to a lack of consensus, or at least I think unanimity was needed, even though consensus is probably the more canonically correct term and path forward. Unanimity has never been really the hallmark of our canonical tradition. If that were the case, very little would have gotten done. But to go back to what you were saying, this particular document, the name of it, the precise name of it is escaping me right now, is actually still available for viewing online. It was signed by all of the autocephalous churches that were present in Crete, and thank God it at least provides a framework for how we consider fasting in contemporary society. And that one section that I alluded to, I may have even said it explicitly, that the autocephalous churches, the local churches, have the responsibility when to dispense economia in terms of fasting practices. This is, I think, positive insofar as it allowed everyone to come to some agreement on fasting. And neither should we impose our belief on how fasting should be done as strictly or as leniently as we may believe on another church. But at least to get everyone on the same page that there are various issues that affect fasting regulations, especially socioeconomic issues. Or many of us, I think we all heard in seminary, in Alaska with the Orthodox communities there, which they have very limited resources, and eating fish is a part of their tradition. These are things that unfortunately need to be that aren't being spoken of as much, that need to be spoken of more, just to express to Orthodox everywhere, and to not as much, like I said, impose, but to at least inform all of the Orthodox autocephalous churches, some of whom may not have experience with, or may not be aware of some of these experiences outside of their own jurisdiction. So this is why these councils are actually extraordinarily helpful, informative, and God willing, in the future there will be more. I hope that answered your question. Right. Right. Yeah, I think the most pastoral thing in this situation to say is, do what you can to the extent that you can. Challenge yourself. Always challenge yourself. But also don't impose on others, but always challenge yourself. Any other questions? Yes. Thank you. Correct. So this is actually, they were attributed to the Holy Apostles. They weren't written by the Holy Apostles, and to the best of our knowledge, they were written at a certain time period in the 3rd or 4th century, by whom we are not sure. But in the Orthodox Church, we have this tradition, this approach whereby even if something has a doubtful beginning, if we're not exactly sure where it comes from, but it encompasses what we believe as Orthodox Christians, it can still play a significant role. And the canons of the Holy Apostles were not necessarily accepted as canons of the Church in the 3rd or 4th century whenever they were promulgated. It actually wasn't until the Council of Trullo, also known as Penthecti, in 690, that they were accepted as being universal canons. In fact, the majority of the corpus canonum of the Orthodox Church was really at that particular council in 690, which said, this council, this council, this council, this council, and these canons of these fathers, they were accepted. It was a wonderful, I think it's in Canon 2 of Trullo, if my memory serves me correctly. It actually goes through all of the councils and canons of the fathers, which are accepted as universal, as having universal status, on a similar level as an ecumenical council. So, yeah, unfortunately, we don't know who particularly wrote the canons of the Holy Apostles. But because they encompass what we believe, they are accepted, and also because they were given ecumenical status or universal status through the Council of Trullo. Well, the official stance of the Orthodox Church through the Council of Crete is that we should endeavor to fast as prescribed on the fasting days dictated by the Church, which are included in the canons. Except, as I mentioned previously, some of them are not included in the canons, but because of holy tradition, we have accepted them as being on those days. The only days that are really explicitly mentioned in the canons are Wednesdays, Fridays, and the period of Great Lent. But other fasts, such as the Dormition, Christmas fast, etc., those are accepted due to holy tradition. So that document at Crete that I had mentioned, that actually is the outline for what the Church officially is stating. And it states that we should follow the fasting regulations as prescribed. But it also makes it also makes mention of, if that is not possible, for one reason or for another, the local church has the ability to prescribe economia, to allow for economia. And in our particular case here in the United States, I think, I can't speak for everyone, but I can only speak for what I see when I go into a supermarket and I see the price of vegetables compared to the price of, one of those family-size pack of chicken breasts, and just how insanely different they are, how expensive fresh vegetables are, which are better for the body, probably better for our spiritual lives as well, but just it's quite saddening that we live in times that put us in this position, but it's also sad that we have not, as a church, kind of stepped up more in addressing this issue. At the time that these canons were written, at the time that St. Nicodemus was writing his commentary in the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, meat was expensive. Shellfish was nothing. It was even in the early 20th century here in the United States, lobster was considered a poor man's food. It was considered food that people shouldn't eat because it was considered dirty. But now, 100 years later, it's obscenely expensive. So I think we need to have a new approach. And this, I don't know exactly how this will happen. I don't know at what level it will happen. But my hope and my prayer is that it's at the level, once again, of a holy and great council like Crete. Only, of course, they're going to have to, I think, address more of the issue, which is socioeconomic and also cultural. I can't speak for maybe what the Church of Georgia has experienced in its history, what its climate is like, what foods are available during what times of year. I can't speak to those issues. Only the Church of Georgia can. But I think these are things that we really need to kind of go more in depth, and we just need to be honest with ourselves. And we need to be honest as Orthodox Christians with one another, as someone from the GOA with someone from, let's say, the OCA or ROCOR or the Antiochians, and beyond even our own milieu here in the United States, with people from international communities saying, these are the problems that we're facing. What are the problems that you're facing? What do you see as your problems? How can we work them out? How can we come to an agreement? How can we move forward, and move forward in a sensible way in the 21st century? I think that's, whether that is going to happen at a more local and unofficial level, or if it has to happen first at a more official level, that I do not know. God willing, hopefully we'll see that change, or at least addressing of the issue. Any other questions? Well, thank you.
There being no other questions, I want to thank Father Bartholomew, the good deacon, for a fantastic presentation, something for us all to think about, to pray about, and to always be mindful of availing ourselves of all that the Church offers in her wisdom to lead us to salvation, into the love and mercy that our Lord offers. We thank all who have joined us virtually, all who have joined us this evening in analog, in person, and we look forward to continuing our Lenten lecture series again next Wednesday after Presanctified Liturgy. Kalidinami, Kali Sarakosti, and again, thank you
Thank
to
you, Father.
Deacon Bartholomew. Good night, everyone. Thank you.